So hello everybody, I'm Jeff Cutmore from CNBC and welcome to our panel. The title is, Can the coronavirus pandemic be a catalyst for inclusive growth? We've got a terrific panel, let me just mention them. Jean-Philippe Courtois is with us, Executive Vice President and President for Global Sales, Marketing and Operations at Microsoft. Jamie Dimon is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of JP Morgan Chase & Company. Sir Jeremy Farrar, the Director of the Wellcome Trust, and Dr. Judith Rodin, President Emerita of the University of Pennsylvania and past President, the Rockefeller Foundation. Let me just say a couple of words as they relate to the panel. We clearly have here an opportunity to use the political capital from the pandemic to rethink structures and systems. But first, obviously, we need to tackle the current impact of the virus and its reemergence, whilst rethinking both the reaction function to the crisis and, quote, how to build it back better. This great aspiration that we hear from governments. But let's focus just at the moment on the here and now. And Sir Jeremy Farrar, if I could bring you in first, just on the medical perspective, we need to be making good decisions right now for that inclusive outcome. You've written about getting real on the vaccine. What do you think the recent AstraZeneca suspension of the trial has told us about vaccine timelines and whether current expectations that we have and we hear governments express are realistic?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to join. Just to deal with your specific question on the pause on the AstraZeneca vaccine trial, I don't think that materially changes anything. Pauses in vaccine trials happen all the time. It's really a sign that the oversight, the independent oversight, the review processes, and indeed the regulatory pathway to getting a vaccine is working well. We will expect to see more of those with both that and other vaccines, but I don't think that materially affects the timeline. I think it's a bigger question than that, and that is we need, as we're thinking about the future, we have to understand this is now a human endemic infection. It's no longer an animal infection that will pass and that will suddenly come out of COVID into a bright new world. This is with us now for, I think, forever. We will have to learn to live with it. We'll have to provide the countermeasures, vaccines and treatment, and we'll have to realign our health systems to be able to deal with these sorts of things. So the vaccine is coming along. I remain optimistic. But again, nobody should also think that those first generation vaccines are going to put us all back to business and work and jobs and everything immediately. I would estimate that those first generation vaccines, of which there are about 7 or 9 currently in development, will in themselves be imperfect, maybe 40 to 60 or so % effective, and perhaps less so in the elderly and other things. So they're not going to be a magic bullet. We're going to have to learn how to live with this with a range of different options.
You wrote back in July about how impressed you were by the support that governments, industry bodies and philanthropists have shown for collaboration. As the new infectious spike is happening, do you see that collaboration fraying, or is it just ineffective at this point in preventing the kind of spiking that we're seeing in the developed and the developing world?
Yeah, these spikes, as you call them, or second waves, whatever you want to call them, they're inevitable. You have an infectious disease which most people are not immune to, and which transmits from people that are asymptomatic all the way through to people who are in hospital with symptoms. And controlling that with lockdown measures and other draconian measures is A, itself extraordinarily difficult, but B, doesn't change the fundamentals of the infection itself. As soon as you lift those restrictions to some degree and you don't put in place the efficient and accessible testing systems and isolation, then this will rebound, as it's doing now in much of continental Europe, and I would predict very soon in UK and the US as well. The only way through this is through changing the fundamentals. And that means investing in vaccines and treatment so that we can both prevent and treat it when it happens. And yes, it has been good to see the scientific community, the business leaders and governments coming together, but maintaining that coalition, not just for a few months, but over months and years ahead, is going to be a real challenge. And I think something we need to come back to on this panel of how we can learn those lessons of that interconnectivity and make sure that we continue that coalition at a time of great geopolitical tension.
Obviously, we're very results focused, and in this case, results equal lives and potential fatalities. Is it as simple as saying that there's just a question of not enough money or how the money is being allocated and spent?
Well, in the end, you need money, and we were pretty successful early on. We raised across the board from industry and governments the money to get it started. The challenge now is to raise that money that doesn't just get you a vaccine, but make sure you can vaccinate those that need it. That's a different order of magnitude. We initially needed about 8 to 10 billion. We raised that actually pretty quickly. But that's to get you a vaccine. If you want to then distribute that around the world, if you want to make it available as needed, independent really of your ability to pay, then you need, we estimate 35 to 40 billion in order to do that, and have the health systems and logistics in order to be able to do that. Raising that sort of capital, which is, I reiterate, the only way out of this in the medium term, that's proved much more difficult.
Jamie Dimon, since we're talking about money, it seems natural to come to you at this point. You've spoken passionately about the need to support workers and excluded communities going forward. But you've also expressed concern, I think, that if we don't see some political meeting of minds in the United States, there is a potential risk of derailing the economic recovery. How disappointed are you by the fact that the Republicans and the Democrats don't seem to be able to put a stimulus deal together at this point, and they don't seem to be able to have a meeting of minds when it comes to helping out those who are losing their jobs or at risk of losing their jobs, given the furlough scheme is winding down?
And so welcome everybody. I'm sorry I can't be there in person because we learn a lot more. We can mingle and talk, and I miss visiting the rest of the world. The governments of the world took dramatic, bold, rapid action, fiscal, monetary, the companies, the vaccine companies, et cetera. And I think that's very admirable. Of course, we're going to be finger pointing and yelling and screaming at each other for years about the parts that didn't go well. And it is a little disappointing we haven't come together in the United States with another round here, because I do think we do need that round. But I actually just want to point out a bigger problem. And because people look at COVID and they say, it unearthed, the problems we have in racial inequality and income inequality and the plight of the poor, et cetera. It really didn't. The fact is, those things have been going on for a long, long time. If you looked at, I'm talking about America now, so it's very convenient in America to look at trade or China or immigration or technology and blame that for our ills. And we may not have handled it all perfectly, but that's not our ills. Our ills are 20 or 30 years of bad policy, bad planning around infrastructure, healthcare, regulations. We've crippled the formation of small business, education. We haven't been doing a good job in institute school education now for 30 years. It's been 160 years since the Civil War, and we've done a terrible job getting our black brethren even remotely close to parity. And those flaws are the same flaws of why the world was unprepared for COVID, and we should have been. The world has a common interest in COVID, terrorism, anti-nuclear proliferation, climate change, and if we don't get our act together, it's going to get worse. And you use the word, the most important was collaboration. It isn't going to work if we all yell and scream at each other. And I have a little bit of hope that coming out of this, there'll be more of the humanity that leads to say, what are our problems? What's the solution? We stop looking at month over month and year over year, because that ain't going to fix it. And one beautiful thing happens if you're not in New York City at 7:00 p.m. every night. If you open up your window, you will hear across the whole city people clapping, yelling, screaming, basically thanking the first responders and the essential workers, who are always essential. But it's a beautiful thing. And just maybe that little bit of humanity will sneak through. We won't make it bipartisan. We won't make it your deal and my deal. But how do we fix inner-city school education? How do we make our safety net work better? How do we get health care to 40 million uninsured? Because it's all doable. It just isn't doable the way we operate today.
You obviously reference some of the alienation, I think, that people have felt as measures have been implemented to try and stop the spread of this disease. You've been very high profile as a company, just urging people to go back to offices and to go back to work. Is part of the answer to figuring out the future, just encouraging people to go back to what was the recent past?
No, look, there will be permanent changes from this, so I think that's being overdone a little bit. And remember, the first thing is safety of our people. So what we're saying is that these places are clean, we've got social distancing, you wear your mask, everything we do is good. I don't know the future better than anyone else. I think going back to work is a good thing. I think there are negatives to working from home. I think our younger people don't, I'm telling you, the analysts and associates, you learn by basically being an apprentice to people sitting next to you. We've seen productivity drop in certain jobs and alienation go up in certain things. So we want to get back to work in a safe way. I mean, this building is now 20% occupied. I've been going to work now for 3 months, by the way, and so I find it much better. So safely, carefully to the extent we can. And I just don't know, and obviously you have experts here on the actual disease itself. We don't want our people to get sick. If we have to go in complete lockdown again, we could do that. I think you're seeing a lot more damage in society today by people staying home, including their health. I mean, you can create more deaths from drugs and overdose and depression, and if we're not really careful, we manage this thing. So, and I think people are trying to, and trying different local solutions. And I don't want to point fingers. Obviously, some people opened up too quickly and opened up unwisely. Particularly young people, they go to parties with 50, 100 people in a room no bigger than this room. That's for trouble. But yes, carefully open up and see if we can get this economy growing for the sake of everybody. If we have another downturn, okay, you're going to have serious economic problems, social problems, et cetera. And so I think governments really should be very thoughtful in trying to intelligently open up.
And let me just pick up on the comments that you were making about how long this period has been where we have entrenched maybe differences of outcome for different socioeconomic groups here. One of the, and I don't want to be too pointy-headed about the finance here, but one of the criticisms, for example, of the Federal Reserve and the current plumbing of the US financial system is that by lowering interest rates for the owners of assets, all you are doing is getting one particular segment of the community richer, whilst those who don't own assets are not seeing any change in their lifestyles or their economic outcomes. You've talked a lot in the past about how you are concerned about the QE policies that have been pursued. Is it time for the Federal Reserve to perhaps acknowledge that its own actions have perhaps led to this distortion in economic outcomes? What would you ask them to do?
It's a very complex question. So I think it's a mistake to say because it helped the wealthy, we shouldn't do it. Because the reason they didn't isn't for that. The reason they did it is to lift up the economy. And if you don't lift up the economy, the people who are going to suffer the most are the poor. So I think that the Fed is thinking about how do we lift up the economy, and if accidentally it helps a wealthy person, so be it. But they shouldn't hurt a wealthy person to make someone feel good. And so I think that they're doing the right thing now, which is to let us get through this. There are going to be serious issues about government deficits, fiscal and monetary stimulation. That's kind of a secondary problem right now. This is the problem. We should get through this, and hopefully cooler heads will prevail, how we can kind of unwind some of the stuff wisely. There are huge fixes to income inequality. I mean, you could have negative income taxes, you could fix education. So to me, there are a lot of things we should be doing to help the poor and stuff like that. Federal policy is not the thing that's going to actually, they should focus on making the economy grow. And that's the other problem with some of the governments. They don't focus on growth strategies. They have policies that don't help growth. If you had 1% higher growth in the United States over a 10-year period, that would be $4 trillion of GDP. And that's like 10,000 per person extra. And that pays for a lot of social safety net, taxes, and so we don't focus on growth anymore, healthy growth. We focus on is blaming each other, and we stifle ourselves because we're unable to do very basic stuff. And again, it's long-term thinking, real policy with real facts and analysis, not guessing and not looking at year over year. The year over year stuff has just become a waste of time, and it causes us to make really dumb decisions.
Jamie, you're in a fortunate position where you get into the room with the people that are making these decisions at the moment. So your advice to Jay Powell would be just do nothing at this stage, keep policy as it is. But when you talk to those in the federal government, now it's your turn to pick up some more of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, I think that the Fed didn't want, I mean, look, we knew we were going to go into this great recession. What they didn't, I think, I'm speaking for them, which I shouldn't be doing, but what they didn't want was a global financial crisis in addition to a great recession. That's where markets close down and people can't get money. And so they kept the markets open, which benefited everybody. You know, they don't need it right now. They're so wide open that they don't need to be pumping it up anymore. Just let nature take its way. And so, you know, and you can look at the day-to-day things that they do. But I think you do need, and the government did do payroll checks, small business support, a bunch of stuff. It really aimed at people, not aimed at companies and stuff like that. Well, of course they help companies too, but they were aimed at helping people keep money in their pockets so they could spend money. And yes, we're going to need another little round. It doesn't have to be $2 trillion, but I think we need a little bit more for small business, particularly for small business and those who are long-term unemployed.
Jean-Philippe Courtois, technology has, for many people, been a savior through the pandemic. It's increased the number of trends: cloud computing, working from home, e-tailing, e-banking. My question to you, though, would be, has it been inclusive in the way that it's been expressed? There are those, it seems, who have been winners, clearly, and continue to take advantage of these opportunities technology provides. But it also seems, as always, technology can leave people behind. How do we prevent that happening at the moment?
Yes, first of all, good morning, good evening, everyone on the call, and I hope everyone is safe and doing well, wherever you are in the world. I would say certainly as a representative of a tech company, I certainly feel privileged to enable a lot of those organizations in the world, either commercializations, governments, NGOs, and others, to do more or actually to tackle tough challenges at times of crisis. I think we've been reflecting as a company on what we can do a better job on. I mean, first of all, there's probably three big trends we've seen happening in the world through technology. One is work everywhere, remotely. Maybe see that conference call could have happened as well on Microsoft Teams or other technologies of the same, have enabled a lot, not just companies, but kids as well, to continue to learn and teachers to educate remotely. So that's massive collaboration happening and redefining what we call a hybrid workplace, which, by the way, is being defined as we talk. There's a lot of different definitions depending on who you talk to. The second big trend is really about digitize everything, which is the way, as an example, health organization have been really working using the combination collaborative technology, what we call low-code, no-code platform development. In our company, we call that Power Platform, enabling organizations like NHS, 1.3 million agents, to use these technologies to enable the first-line agents to do their jobs, to do in Asia or in Africa some COVID-19 detection, triage, to be able, as an example as well, to really figure out the equipment you need, mask, respiratory equipment, and we organize the logistic to get that in the right hands at the right time for the people. So that's really about digitize everything, and it spans across any industries, from banking to retail, logistics, supply chains, and many more. And certainly we see a lot more happening as well when it comes to truly transforming fully a business from left to right. And we've seen a number of companies in very different industries as well decided to make a lot more in 2 months. Actually, Satya, our CEO, said once, 2 months of the first 2 months of COVID-19, much more was done, and in 2 years of actually transformation, last couple of years for many of the companies in the world. But having said that, it's all about being more inclusive. And I think as a company, we believe there's a few things we want to focus on. both in terms of actually inclusion for minorities, for women, girls, and other kids in the world who can have access to technologies. We also want to make sure that we build, and I think we alluded to some of that, sustainability, I would say, solutions as well, leveraging technology, which is more effective in a way of CO2 emissions in a better way, and certainly more equitable as well in a way we co-build solution with enterprise to make it more affordable for a lot more people.
You talked a bit about how companies have utilized technology, but I think this acceleration of trends has also disrupted a lot of companies who thought they may have longer to transition to new models. The other thing that I think is raising red flags right now is concerns that there are just one or two, maybe half a dozen very large technology companies that are doing very well at the moment and may be concentrating power to the degree that they are limiting competitive opportunities for other companies or other parts of the economy. As we think about building back better, Jean-Philippe, should that include a Standard Oil moment for big tech, that we put some limit on the size of these technology companies, or more closely scrutinize what impact they are having on different sectors of the economy?
You know, when we think about our responsibility as a global company that operates in more than 200 countries in the world, we always kind of get back to the core mission we have, which is about empowering every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. What does it mean in the context of big tech, which is your question, Jeff? It means that we have a big responsibility when it comes to really build a trusted and an innovating platform that enable millions of organizations in the world, from the smallest, from the lowest income countries in the world, from NGOs to the largest enterprise on the planet, to actually achieve more through technology. And the way we do that is across actually our cloud and data and AI platform, but we do that deliberately as well. So taking an example as right now, actually, when it comes to clearly social inclusion, not just in the US, by the way, the race issue is global. We have decided suddenly to do a lot more, not just in the representation of Black African American and doubling that next few years, but really investing back a lot more with technology in the community, in the supply chain we have as a global company, which involves a lot of many local, small to mid-sized organizations using technology to their benefits, to grow the business, to actually be part of a supply chain of Microsoft and other tech companies. So that to us is a big, certainly opportunity we have to do more as a company. And we want certainly to extend that when it comes as well to sustainability. We've been making an important commitment a few months back. You know, our CEO Satya Nadella announced a commitment to get to negative CO2 by 2030, and basically be able to really take care of all the emissions created since the inception of Microsoft back a few years back in 1975, by 2050. And to us, that's another way to contribute as well with other companies to innovate on a sustainable, I would say, ecosystem of innovation across finance, across technology, and across governments and other NGOs as well.
Let me make the question a bit more pointed, because you've talked very positively about the carrots, if you like, the positives that technology can bring. But increasingly, I think people are concerned about some of the negatives. And if we shouldn't be looking at maybe how to control market dominance, then maybe we should be very focused on this issue of whether we are heading towards a digital divide between the world's two largest economies, and what the consequences would be of that for inclusiveness. You yourselves were recently party, I think, to the conversations about the future for TikTok. Can I ask you, are you concerned at all that the kind of directives that we are now hearing, not only from Washington, but from Beijing, about technology sharing and technology export, are going to create a world where we have two competing systems rather than one where we are digitally united? And how concerned should we be about that?
Well, it's very clear to us that we've seen over the past many years, but even more recently, last 12, 18 months, growing legislation. And I think a lot of that was due, actually. And we've been very eager as a company back a few years ago, as an example, to be the first company to embrace GDPR at the core of the EU, as you know, and that has become a standard when it comes to data privacy, even globally. You know, in California, in Asia, many countries and regions actually are taking up on GDPR. Beyond GDPR, there's a lot more to be done. A lot more to be done to provide, in a way, transparency, visibility in terms of the data contract between a consumer, a citizen, and a tech company, and what it means, what it implies in terms of the usage of the data, what it implies in terms of the processing of the data. And we are very, I would say, determined as a company to be, and we participate to many of the discussions. The same when it comes to data and AI. As you know, there's a lot going on, of course, on the way data governance should happen, the way we accept or we disagree to engage on some projects that are not necessarily driving a positive outcome for the society. And I think that's something as well we are very keen to be part of from a policy engagement. So you will see Microsoft and other tech companies, not just Microsoft, of course, being alongside of governments, institutions, and NGOs as well, by the way, to make sure we reshape and we evolve, in a way, the policies needed to make that technology world more inclusive for everyone on the planet.
And if you'll just forgive briefly the journalistic question, are you interested in talking again with ByteDance, or are you're done here, you're walking away?
I think everything was said. I'm not going to add any more words, Jeff, to this to the comments we made publicly, and we keep going with the core mission of a company, where we want to enable the customer success of many organizations on the planet, and that's a lot to do.
Thank you so much. Judith, you are the notable author of many books on resilience, on impact investing, on how governments and communities can prepare themselves for the kind of crisis that we are experiencing and have experienced. Are you actually seeing any meaningful shift at the moment as you look around the world in the way governments are thinking about future crisis?
I think governments are focused at the moment on the current crisis, and I think that's a terrible mistake, because crisis is the new normal in the 21st century. We've seen it over and over again, whether it's weather-induced crises, economic crises, now this massive health crisis. And to just mention what Jamie commented on in a slightly different way, these are structural inequities that are being revealed. They have been many, many decades in the making. But crisis, every crisis, any crisis hits poor and vulnerable people more dramatically, more extremely. And so the notion of building resilience is really about preparing for the knowable. And not every future crisis is knowable, but certainly, as is predicted by almost everyone, the next great crisis will be caused by climate change. It will dramatically impact the world, the financial markets. And so we need to begin to address that issue, I think, in a much more effective way and a much more collaborative way across the world. Not only then do you prepare for what's knowable, but you have to build in advance the capacity to rebound more quickly, rebound more effectively, and then the capacity to grow and transform when something happens. So we've been talking quite a lot about things getting back to normal, but normal often has some of the major structural issues that cause the problems in the first place. So we don't want to go back to normal. We want to use crisis as an opportunity when it does occur to really grow and transform and do things differently. The capacity for resilience really has 5 elements that are critical. And this is important for any company, for any government, for cities, and all share these same 5 characteristics that they're successful. The first is awareness, the ability to use data effectively. We've talked about technology. It's really striking. I co-chaired with Felix Rohatyn the recovery from Sandy in New York, and New York State opened their databases to us, and they had amazing data in every silo, but those silos were unable to speak to one another when the emergency occurred. And so how you build data and then give the capacity to use it quickly and effectively. The second is diverse and redundant backups. You know, we've had a manufacturing mantra that says lean and mean, don't build redundancy. But if we don't have redundancies, that builds in the capacity for failure. So we've got to provide enough resources to make that happen. The third is seamless integration, whether that's across our teams, our communication strategy, transparency. Transparency is critical in terms of resilience building. The fourth is what we call self-regulation, which is building in the capacity to delink something if it's failing, so that you can have safe failure rather than catastrophic failure. There will be failures, and so we've got to build resiliently in a way that allows that capacity. And then the fifth is really nimble and flexible operations that can shift gears quickly when new information comes in, whether you're a government or a company. I've seen the lack, but resilience exists in a system. So you asked earlier, Jeff, about collaboration among governments across the world. Resilience requires local collaboration across sectors. So local government, the larger governments in which a locality exists, corporations, NGOs, all of those are part of a system that can make or not make a resilient capacity help people in times of crisis.
Let me ask you a question that's come from our audience, and let me encourage our audience to write in with questions if they'd like to put them to our terrific panel. And the question focuses on the young, which I think is very important at the moment. And the question goes, it's been said that the effects of this crisis will be borne mostly by the younger generation in terms of disruption of education, unemployment, greater debt burden, and so forth. What are the ramifications of that on society? How should we address this in terms of targeting more funds? And is there a way that we can pursue long-term investments towards supporting future generations?
I think what governments are doing is focusing on the short term, getting us out of this crisis. I think the longer term investments will require private capital as well as government funding. And here I think we have a great foundation on which to build. The field of, excuse me, of impact and sustainable investing has grown dramatically over the last several decades. We have about, I think in 2018, the last time it was estimated, over $30 trillion of assets under management in every asset class. We have asset owners like the Norwegian and Japanese pension funds who are pushing this, asset managers who are thought leaders, and lots of collaboration going on that may not be as well known between NGOs and asset managers to create metrics. And after all, the NGOs really can provide technical assistance, and they understand how to produce social and environmental outcomes. So I think young people will, there's no question, be impacted by this. But I think we have to focus our longer term view on the kinds of resources through these kinds of capital investments, as well as government programs, which are highly important in order to help this generation get back on its feet. On the other hand, in the developed world, in affluent countries, there's going to be an enormous transfer of wealth to millennials over the next decade or two. And we are seeing the leading edge of those millennials not wanting just financial returns, putting all of their money in double bottom line and triple bottom line investments because they believe fundamentally and fervently that they can use their capital for the health of the planet, for education, for better housing. And I think their actions will also effect this transformation quite dramatically.
Jamie, can I bring that question to you? I think Judith speaks very eloquently on that question of longer term investment and the need to encourage that kind of investment. Recently, when you've looked at what the public markets have been doing and this whole question of whether some hedge funds and some other investors have been trying to game the technology company share prices by buying call options or derivatives, do you think it's time that that stopped, or at least there was some limit on that activity that's causing that volatility? Because for those whose pensions are in public shares, they may look at the market at the moment and ask themselves, do I trust what these markets are doing? Do I have any confidence when I keep hearing stories about large investment houses or hedge funds manipulating the markets for their own ends?
I call it completely unrelated. And if you're in the markets and that bothers you a lot, you probably shouldn't be in the markets. You're not going to stop people from doing things in markets around the world. That's true in communist countries, it's true in socialist countries, it's true in, I'm not in favor of it, by the way. I think it's outrageous if you manipulate anything or do stuff like that. And but I think Judith, the point is much more Judith saying, long-term policy and proper investments. I say proper investments because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I could show you trillions of dollars of examples of governments doing things that actually had the adverse consequence. So it's not just throwing money. People just thought, it's the funding. Very often, it's not the funding. It's not that we need more money. We need to fix the system. Like, think of inner city school education. Like, Judith pointed out that, the structural flaw, so South Bronx, which is doing well with this recovery, is, relatively, unemployment had come down like 6 to 8%, lower than it's been in generations, is now back to 30%. The kids who can't go to school don't have computers. So, the affluent, they go home, they sit in nice houses and they have their computers. These kids don't. And so to me, have proper public policy. You can throw all the money you had at certain problems and you will fail if you don't think through how you're going to make it work. So I wouldn't focus on the actions of a few hedge funds. I mean, in the markets every day, I'm going to say the number of securities bought and sold is probably something like $20 trillion. And the press loves to focus on that one little thing. That isn't what matters. And so we need good public policy. In fact, I think it takes your eye off the ball. You start focusing on this one thing, acting like that's the problem. That's not the problem. It's structural. It's many years of bad policy. And I say fundamentally bad investment or underinvestment.
Judith, just to come back to you with some more of the questions, as governments lay the groundwork for greater inclusivity, how can they work with corporations? You briefly touched upon where business may get involved here, but I wonder if you have any concrete examples. How do you hope to see this happen, and how do you think it will impact corporations?
Well, we've seen many good examples of multilateral organizations leading cooperative business partnerships. The UNPRI example, where now there are several hundred signatories, private companies from all around the world. I think, to me, the problem is less that we get them to the table to sign some agreement about action, and more that we never track whether they follow through on those actions. So a lot of great press releases, a lot of great handshakes when we could handshake, but not, I think, the kind of systematic measurement and tracking of the outcomes of those kinds of commitments. And I think that really will be essential. But there is no doubt to me that partnership is a form of leadership, particularly when these crises are so complex, when the systems are so complicated. And indeed, unless you diagnose and really do treat the whole system together and make it work together, what often happens is that you have an intervention in one part of the system, and then, if I can borrow a phrase from Jeremy, you get antibodies from other elements of the system that are pushing against your intervention. And so when you look at 50 years or more of huge amounts of money being spent by governments, by development agencies, both regional and bilateral and multilateral. The thing that's terrifying when you look at that is how little real accomplishment, because they didn't focus on the other elements of the system. Number one, that were pushing against their interventions. And number two, how to make their interventions more sustainable when they left. And I believe strongly that unless you bring in business, unless you bring in the markets and ultimately make it work, you don't have sustainability for so many of these interventions. And that's why I keep emphasizing over and over again that the private sector is critically important, not at the pilot phase, not at the early risk phase. Often that's the role of philanthropy. And we did a lot of that. And then government comes in. But ultimately, you need to make markets for so many of these things. Now, there are things that you can't create a market for, like violence against women or children, but education, housing, transit, so many of the technology, so many of the things that companies really can work to provide, make a profit, build a market, often in a developing world. Those are the things that lead to sustainable interventions over time and are part of building a resilient fabric of a collaborative network of action.
Dave Coate has written in asking, given population growth, this is unlikely to be the last pandemic. What do governments need to do to be better prepared for a quick response? And just to pick up on your point about multilateral organizations, Judith, Jeremy, if I might ask you Dave's question, but also add, the WHO was that organization that was meant to raise the alarm for governments around the world. And yet we now have a situation where the world's largest economy, the government of that economy, mistrusts the WHO and other multilateral organizations. Does it now fall upon governments to develop their own rapid response process if they can no longer believe in the WHO?
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the comments Jamie made here. I mean, we are going to face some really big political questions coming out of this. I mean, crises like this, as it did during the 20th century, will, the way we come out of it and the way we define it politically at the end of this, do we want to go back to a sort of more nationalistic agenda? Because if you look at all of the challenges, Judith laid them out, climate change, pandemics, whatever you want to choose, none of these will be national in their impact. And therefore, we're going to have a choice. Do we go to a very polarized world, whether technologically, in health, in the climate change agenda, or actually do we choose this to be a moment when, as we did in the 20th century after the Second World War, we actually chose to come together? And I think we would all agree that actually that choice can only lead us in one direction. I'm just very fearful that our polarized political world at the moment may take us in a different direction. And I think it's for all of us to argue for that coming together and collaboration that everybody has mentioned. It's easy, it's particularly at the moment with populist prime ministers and presidents, to blame somebody outside your own country for all the ills, whether it's Brexit or in this case, the WHO. WHO warned the world on about the 20th of January that this was going to be very nasty and there was no need to wait for things and get on with it. And countries either listened to that, Singapore listened, and it put in place tremendous changes. Germany listened, Korea listened, other countries didn't, and they've gone through a much worse pandemic as a result of it.
And just as we come to the wrap up here, one last question, I think. Let's give this one to you, Jean-Philippe, because it seems to me that all of our speakers have talked about collaboration, but ultimately collaboration requires trust. In a world where increasingly the questioner asks about data and resilience of data, and in an insular and deglobalizing world, the concerns we may have around the use and integrity of that data, maybe we could just finish with a few thoughts from you. How do we make sure that we can trust how the data we give is being used appropriately, and that it is being used in a way that directs us to a better and a fairer society?
I think it's a great question. Obviously, as discussed previously, I think there's a number of commonalities in some of the data policies, but still a lot more to do. I believe that when it comes to the AI policies, really when it comes to what is called the machine learning insights that a company can get, I don't know, as an insurance company, that a government can get when it comes to the health of its citizens, when an automotive company can get when it comes to the drivers in the car, there needs to be for sure a common ground on the way you apply, you design, develop such machine learning and data models that are both transparent, that actually are traceable, and that you can actually find accountability for. I think those are key principles we define as a company, among a few others, including diversity inclusion, by the way, to make sure that organizations across the world, both public sector organizations, commercial tech companies, agree together on aligning on those principles when it comes to truly extract the potential, which can be huge, by the way, in terms of positive outcome for society and economic growth. So we remain optimistic as a company, but we'll need to bring all the stakeholders around the table to agree and embrace those standards across the world, which is a big, obviously, a challenge these days as you go and cross different borders in the world.
Jean-Philippe, thank you so much for wrapping up the conversation for us. And let me just take a moment to thank all of our panelists for their contributions. I think it's been a terrific conversation, and I think very worthwhile. And as I bring the panel to a close here, let me just pass back to our conference chair, Mr. Ho.